All right, folks. I anticipate more people are going to join us. We had over 300 people register for the event, so we might have a larger crowd today. First of all, happy Earth Day. Just wanted to welcome everybody to our final Lunch and Learn program of this year. My name is Tracy Davids. I am the Southeast Program Coordinator based in Asheville, North Carolina. I help to lead outreach efforts for our field team, and I will be your host today. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. We will have a Q&A session at the end. Please post any questions that you have to the Q&A feature you'll find on your screen. Feel free to post any comments in the chat box as well. A little bit about our Lunch and Learn series. This is an educational offering by the Southeast Field Team to help bring you, our members, a little bit closer to the work that we're doing in the field and to let you know how you can help. Today, we're going to be talking about a program that we've been working on for nearly 30 years, the protection and recovery of the Florida manatee, with a focus on our efforts to restore essential warm water winter habitat. Joining me today are two members of our Florida team. The first is Elizabeth Neville, our senior Gulf Coast representative, who works on imperiled species issues throughout the Gulf of Mexico region of Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Liz first joined Defenders as a manatee conservation contractor in June of 2019 and focuses much of her work on protecting aquatic and marine species, such as the manatee and Gulf of Mexico whale. Also joining us from Florida is Elizabeth Fleming, our senior Florida representative based in St. Petersburg, Florida. She has led our manatee program for over 15 years. Among other things, Elizabeth works to protect and restore Florida's imperiled wildlife, conserve core and connective habitat for wide-ranging species, and incorporate wildlife conservation into transportation and land use planning. And finally, joining us today is our program director, Ben Prater, who is also based here in Asheville. He oversees all of our programs and field staff, and he is going to be managing our chat box and Q&A boxes today. So thank you, team, for joining us. Before I turn the show over to Liz to talk a little bit about manatees, I want to just give a little brief overview of Defenders of Wildlife and what we do. So Defenders of Wildlife is a nonprofit organization that's been around since 1947. And our mission is to protect all native animals and plants in their natural communities. And our approach to this mission is direct and straightforward. We work on the ground, in the courts, and on Capitol Hill to protect and recover imperiled wildlife across the continent. And our work on the ground is the focus of our field conservation program, which has 6 offices throughout the country. One is in Alaska, California, the Pacific Northwest, the Rockies and Plains, the Southwest, and here in the Southeast. And as those of you who live here in the Southeast know, we have mega biodiversity coupled with a growing human population and very few public lands, which is why we are here in the Southeast. That biodiversity faces many, many threats. And so we're here making sure that biodiversity is protected. Within our region, we have some focal landscapes, and this helps us to prioritize the work that we do. The first is the Southern Appalachian Mountains, home for amphibians and freshwater fish. In fact, it's a hotspot for amphibians. Next is the Carolina coast, home to the critically endangered red wolf. Then there's the Gulf Coast, home to the Gulf of Mexico whale and biodiversity hotspots like Mobile, Tensaw River Delta. And of course, the Florida Panhandle, home to gopher tortoises and sea turtles. And finally, the Greater Everglades, home to Florida panthers, manatees, and lots of other species. So from the ancient Appalachian Mountains to the longleaf pine savannas of the coastal plain, to the river of grass known as the Everglades, and the windswept dunes of our coasts, this is the Southeast that we call home. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Liz after we launch a trivia question. Have a look at these animals. We have a walrus, a rock hyrax, and an elephant. And our polling question is, okay, which of these animals is the least related to a manatee? The walrus, the rock hyrax, or the elephant? And all of these responses are anonymous, so we won't know who is answering what. So please feel free, put your guess in the box. We've got another 8 seconds. Great. I'm going to end the polling. And the results are in, and most people answered rock hyrax. But actually, the animal least related to a manatee is a walrus. So to give us more information about the manatee, I'm going to introduce Liz Neville to take it from here. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Tracy, and happy Earth Day, everyone. So glad to see so many friends and allies participating today. So I think it's good to start at the very beginning with these things sometimes. So the fundamental question, what is a manatee? Manatees are slow-moving aquatic mammals of the order Sirenia. They have a rotund appearance with grayish-brown skin, rounded bodies, and powerful flat tails. Their closest evolutionary relatives are the elephant and the rock hyrax, as much as they may not resemble the furry little hyrax. Manatees inhabit saltwater, freshwater, and brackish waters, specifically rivers, bays, estuaries, and coastal waters, and they often have algae growing on their backs. They're herbivores, meaning they're vegetarians. They eat 10 to 15% of their body weight in vegetation per day. So for a 1,000-pound manatee, that's at least 100 pounds of food per day. They mostly eat seagrasses and freshwater vegetation. However, they'll sometimes snack on some shoreline vegetation, like this manatee I saw at Blue Spring State Park a while back. Now, Florida manatees spend their winters in Florida, and some travel to other states in the summer. In fact, some individual manatees have migrated as far west as Texas and as far north as Massachusetts. Now, manatees are a member of the order Sirenia, which were named for the sirens of Greek mythology due to the fact that sailors of old mistook manatees for mermaids. The West Indian manatee includes 2 subspecies, the Florida manatee, found in Florida, of course, and the Antillean manatee, which lives along the coasts of many Caribbean islands, Central America, and northeastern South America. There are also manatees in the Amazon River, the Amazon manatee, which are found in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, and Peru. The African manatee swims along the west coast and rivers of 21 countries in Africa, from Senegal to Angola. All manatee species are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. The order Sirenia also includes dugongs, which are fully marine or saltwater herbivores that live in seas in several places in the world, including off of Okinawa, Australia, the Philippines, and Egypt. Finally, the stellar sea cow was the one cold water Sirenian located in the Bering Sea. The stellar sea cow was also herbivorous and fed off of kelp, but was sadly hunted to extinction by Arctic explorers in the 18th century. Now, despite appearing to be quite round and blubbery, manatees in fact have very little fat on their bodies. This combined with a slow metabolism makes it very hard for them to thermoregulate or naturally keep warm, and they are thus very sensitive to the cold. When water temperatures drop below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, manatees experience a condition called cold stress, which can be fatal. Warm water is accordingly essential to manatee survival in the winter. This picture shows Blue Springs State Park in Orange City, which is a protected manatee sanctuary site in the winter. Hundreds of manatees aggregate here on cold days. Other natural warm water refuge sites include the springs of Crystal River National Wildlife Refuge and Homosassa Springs. Back to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Liz. And it is time for our next trivia question. And that question is, how much fat do manatees have on their bodies? First possible answer is they are virtually pure blubber, 6 inches or 1 inch. All right, time's up. And it looks like 73% of you got it right. 1 inch of fat on their bodies. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Elizabeth to hear about the conservation history of the manatee and defenders' role.
Thank you, Tracy, and happy Earth Day, everyone. The Florida manatee is one of 2 subspecies of West Indian manatee that is protected by the Endangered Species Act as a threatened species. The manatee is also protected under the Federal Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act. The Florida manatee is beloved by many. In fact, it was designated as Florida's official state marine mammal in 1975, and November is designated as Manatee Awareness Month in Florida. Although no one knows exactly how many manatees existed in the past, hunting is believed to have caused their initial decline. And right now, the Florida manatee population is estimated at around 8,800 animals, which is a significant increase from 1,300 animals, which was the manatee's population estimate when I first started working at Defenders in 2004. So as a result of years of concerted and dedicated efforts by agencies and organizations such as Defenders of Wildlife, the Florida manatee population has grown steadily over the last few decades to the point where it was downlisted from endangered to threatened in 2017. While the manatee has made progress over the years, recent events, which we will discuss in a moment, have demonstrated that the animal remains vulnerable and requires ongoing management, so it is not out of the woods just yet. So when the Endangered Species Act became law in 1973, the Florida manatee was one of the first species listed. And while associated protections have helped the Florida manatee population to increase since then, the animal still faces many serious threats. The greatest immediate threat and human cause of manatee mortality is collisions with watercraft, which kill more than 100 manatees per year on average. And the greatest long-term threat facing the manatee is loss of warm water winter habitat. They also are threatened by entanglement in fishing gear, harassment by humans, ingestion and entanglement involving plastic debris, red tide and other harmful algal blooms, and impacts of climate change. They can also be crushed in locks and floodgates. Defenders works to address these threats. And Liz is going to talk in a little while about a really exciting project to restore and protect natural warm water habitat as a top conservation priority. So for many years, Defenders of Wildlife has been a leader in advocating for policies that protect manatees and their habitat. And for example, litigation that we joined with Save the Manatee Club and other organizations years ago led to a landmark settlement in 2000 that created 17 refuges and sanctuary areas, which are protected areas for manatees, as well as a number of enforceable manatee protection speed zones. Since that time, many other additional protected areas and speed zones have been established. And I just want to state so people understand, while these decisions were so important, have helped us expand protections for manatees over the years, the restrictions on boating and coastal development proved to be a lightning rod and have caused some controversy that have had some backlash. So that's always out there on the landscape with our conservation work. So for human population growth in Florida is one of the greatest challenges we face for protecting all species and their habitat. Human population growth impacts manatee conservation in a number of ways. And in recent years, Florida has surpassed the state of New York as the third most populous state in the entire country, with more than 21 million residents. So this has resulted in increased development, habitat fragmentation, pollution, more boaters out on the water, disturbance, and other human manatee conflicts. So the leading immediate threat to Florida manatees is collisions with watercraft. Propellers and boat hulls inflict serious or mortal wounds, and most manatees have a pattern of scars on their backs or tails after surviving boat collisions. In fact, scars are one of the main ways that researchers can identify individual manatees. Defenders have successfully advocated for the designation and enforcement of many manatee protection speed zones to make waters safer for manatees across the state of Florida. Coastal residents and commercial development continues to degrade manatee habitat. And the greatest long-term threat involves the loss of warm water habitat that manatees need to survive. As Liz had mentioned earlier, they can become susceptible to cold stress at temperatures below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And development has greatly reduced the natural springs available to manatees to take refuge and stay warm in these natural areas, so that 60% of the manatee population now relies on warm water outfalls from artificial sources, such as power plants. There are some days where there are more than 2,500 manatees that go to winter or shelter at these warm water artificial power plants, and a significant number could be lost in the coming years if natural areas aren't available, and when manatees relying on the power plants don't have access to that water as the power plants are shut down or experience power failures. So manatee survival will depend on protecting natural spring flow and maintaining the integrity of ecosystems and habitat sufficient to support a viable manatee population. And so we're working to protect natural areas of manatee habitat, such as Crystal River National Wildlife Refuge and Blue Springs. And Liz is going to describe an important habitat restoration project that will open up even new areas to manatees that they can't access right now. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and FWC have recently released a plan, which we've been waiting for quite a long time, called the Florida Manatee Warm Water Action Plan, that lays out the needs for protecting manatees and regional networks of natural warm water that have healthy food sources nearby. And defenders will partner with agencies, other organizations, and utility companies to help ensure that these recommendations of the plan are implemented. And we also will work together to ensure that manatees can transition from these artificial power plants and other sources to natural areas that we need to have more of in the state. We also need to do a better job of coexisting with these large herbivores. When manatees need to shelter in warm areas to survive during cold weather, they sometimes encounter people who want to interact with them, and they can be disturbed, and it can cause them to flee the warm water areas, which can place them in danger. Also, well-meaning people sometimes try to offer manatees food and water, which is illegal because it can change their behavior and condition them to approach people, boats, docks, and marinas, putting them in harm's way. And so usually we do quite a bit of outreach, and we talk with people about ways that they can help manatees. Things have been very different this year for everyone, given COVID and restrictions and associated issues with that. So our outreach events and in-person opportunities to engage with the public have been put on hold. For example, at festivals and other outreach events, we interact regularly with members of the public and distribute information about how we can take action to protect manatees. For example, on this card, and very simple, practical approaches such as, while someone is boating, to please be alert and pay attention for signs of manatees on the water, and wearing polarized sunglasses helps people see down below the surface of the water. So we provide information like this, as well as the wildlife alert number that people can call in Florida to report an injured, sick manatee. So this year, I'm sure a lot of you have heard in the news, we have a significant issue going on right now, right before our very eyes. It is clear that threats to manatees remain severe and they must be addressed. So far this year, 674 and perhaps more, I mean, approaching 700 manatees, let's say, have died in the state of Florida. And it's on track to surpass a previous record set in 2013 for the entire year, when 830 manatees died. So NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, has declared this as an unusual mortality event on the Atlantic coast of Florida, extending in the Indian River Lagoon around Cape Canaveral all the way down to the Keys, demanding an immediate response. Why is this happening? This winter, when many manatees emerge from sheltering in those warm water areas that they have to go to stay warm, when they came out and they're hungry and they need something to eat, their usual staple of seagrasses were gone in many areas. They had nothing to eat, and many of them perished from complications associated with malnutrition and outright starvation. So much of the loss of the seagrass stems from poor management of Florida's lands and waters, pollution caused by overdevelopment, and poor enforcement of water quality standards. All of this has contributed to harmful algal blooms, which have shaded out and killed seagrass. We had a recent event in Piney Point, which is setting the stage for a similar situation on Florida's west coast, whereby Florida Department of Environmental Protection authorized the discharge into Tampa Bay of more than 215 million gallons of toxic wastewater from a defunct phosphate processing facility. Pumping this nutrient-rich water into Tampa Bay could cause algal blooms such as red tide, putting manatees and other wildlife and seagrass at risk. And this is in an area where Tampa Bay has, for decades, done a lot of seagrass restoration. It was considered a model and a success story for the state. So we don't want to see this backslide into other, such as in other areas. These are wake-up calls. What we're doing to our lands and waters, and it's killing manatees. I mean, we all have to pay a lot of attention. This is a wake-up call. Manatee die-offs are tragic and preventable, and the underlying causes are water pollution and habitat loss, and they must be addressed in a meaningful way. We are pressing state and federal agencies to take immediate and effective action. And the news isn't all bad. It is Earth Day, so this is our call to action. But Liz is going to discuss a very promising project that will allow manatees to access more essential habitat that they need. There is actual habitat here that they can't get to now, but if they could, it would help a lot. So I'm going to turn it back to Tracy, but we have some good news ahead.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, that's my cue to launch the third and final polling question or trivia question for today. And the question is, or the Ocklawaha is known for its drowned springs. How many drowned springs are there? 3, 7, 10, or 20? Give you another 15 seconds to give your answer. The results are in, and most people answered, 48% answered that there are 10 springs. Well, the actual answer is that the Ocklawaha River has 20 springs that are submerged by the water impounded by the Rodman Dam. When the river is restored, these springs will be revealed and accessible to manatees. So restoring the Ocklawaha will also help to revitalize Silver Springs, which Liz will share with us shortly. Liz, on to you.
Thank you, Tracy. Now that we've discussed some threats to manatees, two major ones, of course, being water pollution and habitat loss as demonstrated by this year's manatee die-off, and some of Defender's work to address these threats, I am excited to tell you about the benefits that restoring the Great Florida Riverway will bring to Florida's manatees. This restoration project will provide access to warm water winter habitat for hundreds of manatees, something that this species needs urgently. This restoration is the single greatest thing we can do to help manatees in Central and North Florida right now. Now, the Great Florida Riverway is a 217-mile system of 3 rivers and 50 freshwater springs that flows north from the Green Swamp and Lake Apopka in Central Florida to the Ocklawaha River, is fed by famous Silver Springs through the Silver River, and reaches all the way to the Atlantic Ocean through the St. Johns River and its estuary. The riverway flows through both rural and urban areas, from the Ocala National Forest to the city of Jacksonville. As you can see, this is a vast and interconnected system that supports many ecological and human communities. Restoring the Ocklawaha River, the heart of the Great Florida Riverway, is crucial to ensuring the ecological and economic health of this region. An essential first step to this restoration is reconnecting the natural flow of the Ocklawaha to the St. Johns River. This short video shares a bit about the background and the potential this restoration has for many native species, including and especially manatees.
The Ocklawaha River has been dammed for 50 years as part of the failed Cross-Florida Barge Canal project. This flooded 7,500 acres of forested wetlands and 20 freshwater springs, obstructing river migration pathways. Restoring the Ocklawaha by breaching the dam will benefit wildlife. Species like the Florida black bear, Florida panther, bobcat, wild turkey, and white-tailed deer will have new territory to roam in the corridor between the Osceola and Ocala National Forests. Healthier forests will benefit native birds like the bald eagle, osprey, and wood duck. Fish and other aquatic species will migrate through the open river and access the Ocklawaha springs. Restoration will also provide essential warm water winter habitat for hundreds of manatees, especially at Silver Springs. Defenders of Wildlife supports restoring the Ocklawaha through policy outreach and as a member of the Free the Ocklawaha Coalition. Follow Defenders of Wildlife to learn more.
Now, before I share some more about the benefits of restoring the Great Florida Riverway, I think it helps to give a brief overview of why the Riverway became impounded as part of the Barge Canal project in the first place. While the idea to dig a canal across the Florida Peninsula was first thought of by the Spanish colonizers in the 1500s, as far as we know, it did not actually commence until 1964 after a couple of false starts. The Ocklawaha was dammed as a part of this project in 1968. However, this happened during a time when environmentalism and television were beginning to permeate mainstream public consciousness in the United States. Images of an Army tank-like machine called the Crusher Crawler decimating precious cypress forests were broadcast and ignited considerable outrage. In 1971, an injunction was granted halting the Cross-Florida Barge Canal in a lawsuit led by Florida Defenders of the Environment and the Environmental Defense Fund. Following this, President Nixon ordered that the Cross-Florida Barge Canal project be halted. Since then, despite a Florida governor directive to partial restoration and subsequent studies illustrating the benefits of restoring the natural flow of the riverway, the dam remains in place. Now, this is the Crusher Crawler, the machine that flattened 7,500 acres of forested wetlands in order to construct the Rodman Dam and Reservoir. An additional 8,000 acres of forest are stressed by the artificial water levels caused by the dam. Now, the left side of this slide shows the status quo. You can see the dam structure well past its 50-year life expectancy and a number of floating logs, remnants of the cypress forest. But on the right side, you can see Cannon Springs, one of the beautiful drowned springs of the Ocklawaha. Every few years, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection lowers the water level of the reservoir for a few months to manage vegetation and water quality, and the beautiful freshwater springs that are usually covered up by the artificially high water caused by the dam are revealed. So if you go to Cannon Springs today, you can't see this beautiful blue water, But if the Great Florida Riverway were restored, this and the other Ocklawaha springs will be accessible. If the Great Florida Riverway were reconnected by restoring the natural flow of the Ocklawaha to the St. Johns River, manatees would likely benefit tremendously. The 20 freshwater springs that are currently drowned by the artificial water levels caused by the dam would be revealed, and many of these, such as Marion Blue Spring, are large enough to provide shelter for manatees in the winter. The Ocklawaha springs in their current state, inundated by the Rodman Reservoir, are not usable as warm water winter habitat for manatees because the stagnancy, so the stillness, and depth of the water renders them too cold during chilly winter weather to serve as appropriate warm water habitat. However, without the dam, the springs will be returned to their natural levels and assume their natural temperatures. And the fact that approximately 100 manatees currently utilize the system, despite obstructions like the dam and lock system, is an encouraging sign that more manatees will use the system in a restoration scenario. Now, in addition to the Ocklawaha Springs, Silver Springs in Marion County would be freely accessible to manatees, which is really significant because as many as 500 animals could take refuge in this famous spring system in the winter. Currently, manatees can only access Silver Springs through the lock system that was constructed as part of the dam, and this acts as a significant limiting factor for manatees using this area. In addition to improving the ecosystem for manatees, the benefits to the park and local economy by virtue of increased visitation and resultant income would likely be significant as well. However, this is a really important note. As Elizabeth discussed earlier, manatee harassment, so meaning feeding manatees or disturbing them while they are undertaking essential survival activities such as foraging or resting, can place them in grave danger. And this problem has become increasingly severe in the age of social media, where even people with really good intentions at times use manatees as props for their photos. So as economically beneficial recreational use of the system increases with restoration, increased education on safe coexistence within manatee harassment prevention will be essential to ensuring an optimal restoration scenario for manatees. It is an amazing experience to see manatees while out paddling, but please make sure to keep 2 kayak lengths or 20 feet away from manatees at all times. Restoring the Great Florida Riverway has wonderful potential for manatees. We just need to do our part to make sure we aren't loving them to death in the process. Now, restoring the Great Florida Riverway will provide significant benefits by way of improved water quality and increased freshwater flow. Thousands of acres of forested wetlands will be revitalized and restored, and this will increase natural biofiltration of water in the system. Restoration will bring an additional 150 to 276 million gallons per day of freshwater flow from the Ocklawaha to the St. Johns River and estuary. This will help improve coastal resiliency in the time of climate change and support salinity balance, the balance of salt and freshwater in the system, which will help support healthy seagrasses in turn. Additionally, restoration will reduce the likelihood of harmful algal blooms and support a better long-term balance between nitrogen and phosphorus in the system. Defenders of Wildlife advocates for restoration of the Great Florida Riverway as a member of the Free the Ocklawaha River Coalition for Everyone, a coalition of 59 organizations, businesses, and faith groups that support restoring this riverway for the benefits to all Floridians, our economy, environment, and more. This coalition is led by Margaret Spontak, who is a passionate and conservation visionary and a resident of Marion County, through which much of the Ocklawaha River flows. The coalition is employing an inclusive, multifaceted, multi-stakeholder approach to support restoration and envision beneficial and environmentally suitable recreational opportunities to preserve the region's longstanding outdoor traditions. I co-chair the coalition's advocacy committee, which is dedicated to communicate the benefits of this restoration project to key leaders. A significant advocacy milestone came to pass earlier this spring, whereby over 22,000 supporters, whom we refer to as the Voices for the Rivers, wrote to Florida's governor asking that the Great Florida Riverway be restored. These letters were delivered to the governor and other key leaders, accompanied by copies of this beautiful Voices for the Rivers book, which provides information about the places, people, and stories along this river system, which can be viewed electronically at greatfloridariverway.com. Now, today we've discussed the manatee facts, manatee protections, and ongoing threats, and how restoration of the Great Florida Riverway will restore essential warm water winter habitat for hundreds of manatees. However, we need your help to ensure that the underlying causes of this year's ongoing manatee crisis are addressed. So what can you do? Please head to our website, defenders.org, and click the Take Action button to send your own letter to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, asking the agency to improve water quality, restore essential manatee habitat, and ensure that manatee protections are kept in place and enhanced. Thank you so much for your time on this Earth Day, and I'll now turn it back over to Tracy and Ben, who will moderate our question and answer session.
Thank you so much, Liz and Elizabeth. That was really interesting, informative, and inspiring. Really appreciate your work on this. Ben, do we have any questions?
We did receive a few, but please, if you do have a question, would love to get those into the Q&A here. The ones I had, I attempted to answer, but I'll go ahead and read those questions and do so live for each of you. One of the questions related to power plants was if manatees are actually susceptible to radiation at those power plants. My answer, but I would certainly defer to Elizabeth and Liz, is that my understanding is that majority of the effluent we're dealing with is from coal-fired plants, and they're coming offline, just part of the threat of that warm water artificial habitat being gone. But I don't know if they actually congregate near nuclear power plants, but I imagine that even if they did, the radiation risk would be quite low, considering how carefully monitored and regulated those plants are. But any other answers to that question from our panelists?
My understanding is that there aren't other nuclear power plants left in Florida that manatees use. There was one in Crystal River, which was decommissioned some years ago. And there's really only one major coal-fired plant that they're still using, and that's the TECO one right here in Tampa Bay. The other power plants themselves, many of them, Florida Power and Light is retooling all of its power plants specifically to make them more efficient and also to accommodate the manatees' need for warm water. So the ones on the East Coast and the one in Fort Myers are all going through a process. Some of them have completely finished retooling their entire system to ensure that the warm water which is delivered that manatees use is still available to them. Now that is not allowed in most other states of the country. It's unusual in Florida, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has actually required that power companies, that Florida Power and Light, in doing this, accommodated for manatees' need to use that warm water. And this kind of feeds into that question about what to do in the future. And as I had mentioned, there is a Florida Manatee Warm Water Action Plan, which is precisely set up to deal with what is going to happen in the future when manatees will no longer have access to these electric power plants that are operated in such a manner that create this warm water. In the future, we don't believe that will happen any longer. It will be phased out. So as far as radiation concerns, I'm not familiar with that. This Piney Point discharge that just happened in Tampa Bay, the government sources, DEP and others, went out of their way to say that the material that was put into the water was not radioactive. But it was.
Elizabeth, we actually did get a question about that Piney Point spill, and the question was how that leak or that spill relates to manatees. My assumption, of course, is anytime you introduce chemical pollution, it creates imbalances and may allow for algal blooms, which then in turn starve out seagrass, and that's really the direct effect to manatees.
It had a ton of phosphorus and nitrogen in it, two of the largest. That's what they make fertilizer out of, and it is made to spur growth of plants and agriculture. But when it's put in the water, it just fuels these algal blooms, and some of them kill manatees directly. Red tide has a toxin which kills manatees directly, And then some of these other kind of algal blooms just shade out the seagrass that they need to eat. So either way, they're not good. And the point is that Tampa Bay has done an excellent job in the last couple decades cleaning up all that kind of pollution and making our seagrass beds have really become as plentiful as they used to be in the 1950s. It's been a real recovery effort and a success story. And a lot of us just fear that this event that happened is just going to send that all into a backslide.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So another question we got was related to, obviously now we're in a high mortality event. And it's been designated as an unusual mortality event, which does mean that the mortality we're experiencing is outside the sort of normal baseline rate that we experience annually. The question was related to that baseline, sort of what the estimated population and percentage of deaths as they relate to past years. Are they going up? Are they going down?
This year is on track to be a record year. So I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think it was also just sort of what does the average mortality look like each year? So when we hear 700, how bad is that compared to what happens each year?
There's the FWC, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, keeps track of annual mortality, and they do a 5-year average, and we are above it this year. We're certainly above it for any of the months at this same time of year. It's well above the last few years.
Yeah.
But it is on track to, I mean, if the record year ever was 830 and we're already approaching 700 and it's only April, it's not looking too good this year.
Yeah, quite tragic. The next questions get our attention over to the Ocklawaha restoration. So Liz, probably good for you to jump in here. And these questions kind of go together, so I'm going to combine them, which is, what is the argument presented against opening the dam and therefore the river? And related to that, what purpose is that dam actually serving right now?
Thank you so much. And those are excellent questions. So I guess I'll answer them in reverse because I think that's helpful. So the dam was only ever constructed as part of the Cross Florida Barge Canal project, which, as we discussed, was never completed. So it was constructed for an unfinished project, and it does not serve a purpose like providing power generation or anything like that you see in dams, for example, in the Northwest. Now, the argument that is often presented against restoring the natural flow of the river is twofold. There are groups of bass fishermen who like to fish in the artificial lake created by the dam. And the second is that, so we refer to it as Rodman Reservoir because that is how it is commonly referred to. But the thing is, a reservoir denotes a source of drinking water, which this actually is not a feasible source of drinking water. It's too expensive to convert the water, to cleanse the water to be safe to drink because of the chemical processes and to transport it to somewhere it would be needed. So those are the arguments that are presented, but a really important point is that there is going to be benefits to fisheries as a whole, particularly fish biodiversity throughout the riverway in a restored river scenario. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you. So here's a fun question. So what can manatee advocates like us do to actually help educate the public of the dangers of those wildlife selfies and other stressful human encounters?
I really like that question. Would you like to answer that one, Elizabeth, or should I take that one?
Go ahead.
So I think, and this kind of goes to social media dynamics in general, right? I think that adding your voice, if you have a social media platform or even in conversation with others, to talk about the harms of manatee harassment can be really important. As Elizabeth mentioned, disturbing manatees, harassing them can be really dangerous to them if it drives them away from behaviors they need to be doing to survive, particularly in the winter. So I think if you, post a picture of a manatee, you can make those points. When you're in conversation, make those points. And of course, I think it's sometimes more productive to do so, one-on-one or in a loving and non-judgmental way, rather than, seeking out people doing offending behavior and publicly shaming. I think that an individual call in to better behavior can be really effective. And as Elizabeth shared, we have, responsible interaction materials on Defenders of Wildlife's website. And so I think, sharing, good materials like that and guidelines can be really productive.
Also, there, oh, go ahead. I was just going to mention that there is a recording of this webinar that will be shared with everybody who registered for the event. So please feel free to share the recording with family and friends.
And ironically enough, a lot of the people posting videos and selfies and footage of them interacting inappropriately with manatees has helped law enforcement track them down and able to educate them about why that is not helping manatees. There was a guy not too long ago, a couple of years ago, jumped off his dock onto the back of a manatee, and he put that on Facebook, and they found out who he was and paid him a visit. And then at Crystal River National Wildlife Refuge, people actually taking a baby manatee away from its mother and holding it up for a picture and stuff. But I do think people, through some of these events, and there's been some law enforcement, and there has been a lot of public, a big effort to make the public aware about why that's wrong. So I think it's gotten better than it used to be.
So a quick question about the role that, and Tracy, I know I'm mindful of time, so please feel free to tell me when we're out. But have any natural disasters played a role in destroying some of our natural warm water habitats for manatees?
Climate change, what's a natural disaster?
I'm assuming he said such as hurricanes. So have hurricanes had an impact on those warm water habitats?
I'm not sure they've had an impact per se on warm water habitats. There have been manatees washed out of their natural areas during really significant storm events. They end up in golf courses or up inland into areas when there's flooding. I think it was Hurricane Irma a few years ago. We had a really odd situation in the Tampa Bay area where it was the tide washed out for like 4 days. It just was an exceptionally low tide, and it left all kinds of manatees stranded on mud flats out in the area. So the Wildlife Commission was getting all these calls from people saying there's a manatee, out in the middle of this dry area. But I know Crystal River has done very well. They have, I think the warm water areas, the natural areas, have actually withstood hurricanes and other natural events pretty well.
Yeah, Elizabeth, that's a really great point. It is worth noting that intact natural areas, or those that have been restored that maintain their ecological function, also are more resilient to those natural perturbations. Now, granted, it can be argued, and I think we're seeing that the frequency and intensity of these storms is increasing with the warming climate. But again, our best defense for wildlife and for the safety of people is an intact, well-protected natural ecosystem. So one very direct question, I think it's a good one, and this is probably for you, Liz, which is, what's the timeline on this Ocklawaha effort?
Thank you,
How long
Adrian.
will it take to restore?
That's a really good question. So there have been studies as to, what the pacing and steps involved in the restoration would be. My understanding is that it's going to be about a 3 to 4 year process from the initiation of restoration to completion. There will need to be an act by the governor or Florida legislature to get it going. This has been studied. It's really ready to go. It just needs to be initiated by our governmental forces in power. And then there will need to be, some significant work to begin with a phased drawdown of the system, as well as restoration activities.
Thank you, Liz. And there was a little bit of back and forth in the chat regarding just sort of what we can do when it relates to these pollution events. And I think it's similar to the answer you gave on the Ocklawaha timeline, which is political action. We need to be reaching out to our representatives, our legislators, and reminding them of the importance to you and to wildlife that a clean and healthy water system and free of pollution is essential. So I think it does just come with a level of being willing to speak and hold our elected officials accountable. And then we have some more technical questions. There's a question about whether or not a map exists that shows the habitat of manatees and the overlap with current power plants and congregation sites. I would imagine that's probably available through the Warm Water Action Plan, but Elizabeth, is there a more direct resource?
Certainly the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has that, and there probably is one in the Warm Water Action Plan. But
okay. And then there's also a question, and Liz, you may know the source. Obviously, this system is, as you mentioned, been studied over and over again, but looking at the average annual profile of water temperatures in the Ocklawaha and St. John's. Interested in a source for that information.
I don't have a direct link necessarily. A lot of this information, like the water levels in particular, is on USGS. That's a good place to start, but I would say either FDEP or USGS would have that information most likely. But if that's referring to my point earlier about why the reservoir is not appropriate habitat, it's just kind of a pretty well-established principle when you look at water bodies that are dammed versus free-flowing. And that's that when the water is stagnant, it's forced to stay in one place or flow a lot more slowly than it would naturally. It's going to be colder in the winter and hotter in the summer because it's not moving. There's not that natural movement and flow. And the depth affects this too, of course.
Absolutely. You do not get mixing into your various layers of water temperature delineation. So I think that's fascinating to think about. How and it's something that I find really fascinating when it comes to wetlands restoration and how really the water level and the association of temperature and the habitat that's provided affects the timing for species, particularly migratory birds that need to feed in those areas. So not only is clean water important, but the right amount of water, the right time of year is also critical. So as we know, best exemplified by the Everglades, Florida has a lot of environmental issues when it comes to our water systems, and manatees are sort of that canary in the coal mine for us. And that sort of concludes the questions I've received, Tracy.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you everybody for joining us today and for all the great questions. We really appreciate it. I have one final bit of business, and that's to announce who the winner of our drawing is. And it's Anne-Marie Aud. So congratulations, Anne-Marie. If you're still on the call, we will send out your Defenders prize pack probably within the next week. So stay tuned, keep your eye out for it. And happy Earth Day, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
thank you.
Happy Earth Day. Thank you so much.